to episode 8 of Mosif's APIs over IPAs podcast network. I'm Derek Gilling, your host today, and the CEO of Mosif, the API analytics platform. Joining me is Tyler Jewell, the managing director at Dell Technology Capital. Before he was the CEO of API management platform company WSO2. As an investor, he's placed almost $150 million over in DevOps companies and is very focused on developer-first companies out here. Happy to have you here today.
Good afternoon, Derek.
Cool. Well, just to kick things off, would love to hear your story from starting off as CEO of WSO2 to managing director at Dell Capital.
Yeah, I started in the software industry about 25 years ago as an engineer, and then moved into product at some large publicly traded companies, BEA and Quest Software. And along the way, I got opportunities to run companies as well. You do the big company leadership thing, and then you have some ideas, and you go off and do some startups. I was CEO of a small media company that had been started by Ed Roman, and then eventually got bought by TechTarget. That was like in 2004. And then after my second stint at a large publicly traded company, I started my own company in 2011 called CodeEnvy. CodeEnvy was a cloud IDE, cloud developer workspace, at a time when it was not really a well-regarded category. And we grew that business over 5 years. That was acquired by Red Hat. And one of the investments I had made in 2009 was WSO2. I had been on the board for a number of years, and that company had grown up pretty nicely, and the founders asked me to come, become their CEO. So I took over the reins and was CEO for a few years. And that company's at scale, profitable, over 600 employees now around the world. On that front, one of the largest open source companies by revenues. And all along the way, I'd been doing investments either as an angel or as a VC, been invited to participate, and it made about a dozen investments, all in developer-related businesses. Sauce Labs, WSO2, CodeEnvy, InfoQ, Cloudant, App Harbor, Zero Turnaround, a bunch of others as well. And and then Dell came knocking. They were a really well-regarded VC unit. They'd been looking to expand the partnership. They were looking for somebody who had expertise in enterprise infrastructure, had been an operator, and had investment experience. And so it was just a great combination, and then just a great group of people. And so I decided to make the leap here on that front.
Awesome. No, super awesome to see having that operator experience along with the investing side, even from your personal angel investing. We've been noticing that you pushed out this new developer-led landscape back in 2020. What was the motivation behind that, and can you share some of those insights?
Yeah. So I think early on in my career, 20 years ago, when I was starting to work on developer tools or in and around developer businesses, the common refrain was that there's no money to be made in developer-oriented businesses. I still think that that's probably a common attitude that a lot of people have about it. And so I've always been on this march towards getting the broader investment business and technology ecosystem to have a stronger appreciation for the value that developers and developer-based businesses can bring to the table. And in order to do that, I think that a lot of people are just don't recognize how big that market space is. And so as part of my just kind of daily reading routine, I've been slowly collecting all the products, at least commercial-based products that I think fit somewhere into this landscape that were developer-led or developer-influenced. And I've been building that up for over a decade. And I finally said, hey, might as well publish it. And I bet you people would get a lot of value in seeing this just the raw number of companies and products that covered this ecosystem. And it turns out it's about 1,200 products, commercial-based products that generate revenue in some form or fashion. Most of those are probably across 900 or so companies, all of which have raised venture capital or in some cases bootstrapped themselves. And it's generating almost all those products together about $40 billion in annualized recurring revenues. And so if you think about all those businesses that were either started by a developer, or they make products bought by developers, or heavily used by developers, the just the raw influence of the developer ecosystem is really significant. It may now account for well over $1 trillion of value out in the marketplace. So it was just an exercise to get the rest of the ecosystem to see the world, and have a positive affiliation to it the way I have.
Oh, over $500 billion in value. That's quite a bit, I guess, when we look at Twilio and what are they, like half a billion, or sorry, $500 billion, or sorry, $500 million in 2015. It was crazy
Yeah,
to
that's
see
right.
that growth.
Yeah,
Not half a trillion, that would be a little bit different, but cool. When it comes to looking at founders, is there anything that you notice different in terms of developer first companies versus a more traditional sales led
a traditional
organization?
company. Yeah, well, developer-led businesses are almost always started by engineer. You know, um, uh, that engineer may or may not have commercialization experience, go-to-market experience. Um, so you have to work a little bit more to help them build the team that's going to be able to balance out the strengths that they bring. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of developers that are starting businesses today, they may not have commercialization experience, but they do have open source maintenance experience. And a lot of the process of maintaining and growing a community in and around an open source project is a lot like very similar to the skills necessary in building out a commercial organization as well on that front. So the balance is increasingly there on that front. Um, and that's kind of the biggest components of what you see.
Does that mean you think about acquisition and go-to-market strategy differently when you look at these different companies, or is it roughly the same metrics like MRR and sales funnel? Or
You look at the metrics that are appropriate for a business, or depends upon the type of business that they're building. So not all businesses are the same. So if the developer is building a cloud-based business, yeah, you might work with SaaS metrics on that front. But if it's a open source business or an open core business, there might be other metrics that aren't so much SaaS metrics, but related to classic ARR, quota coverage, cost of customer acquisitions, things of those natures that are a little bit more oriented to that on-prem sale, along with recognizing that growth of the open source is the top of the funnel. And so there's a whole series of DevRel, developer relationship metrics that you've got to incorporate as well on that front.
definitely. And when we look at the consumer world, the Hotmail hack where it's like sent from Hotmail, sent from my iPhone. Any cool hacks that you've seen within the developer landscape that is quite unique?
In terms of go-to-market acquisition as a hack, I don't really think there's anything you can do to hack. What I will say is that regardless of whether it's a developer-focused business or anything else in the enterprise software space, a lot of the difference between the companies that are successful and those that aren't is the ability to network and hustle on behalf of the founders. So whether it's networking with amazing engineering talent, or networking to potentially acquire early customers, or networking on a business development front, those founders who really invest into continuously building relationships have a tendency to perform better than those that obsess about just product, or just obsess about hiring their people and kind of have a little bit of an inwardly view.
That's a really good point. It's easy to get buried into product itself and think about developer experience, but people are still people, even if you're a developer. So how do you maintain those relationships and push forward is always important, right?
Yeah, and I think that it's very rare for somebody to get inbound interest on something. Innovation and interest in what you're doing tends to come from people just knocking on a lot of doors and sharing what they're doing, and then finding people who share the same values. And people who share the same values have a way of gravitating towards each other, but then you've got to nurture that and then grow that and grow that. And next thing you know, you've actually got a legitimate business there on that front. But that basic exercise is something that founders that's a skill they have to learn if they don't have it.
Definitely. And when you think about things like developer experience and being empathetic towards developers, how do you actually get it right? Sometimes we see companies that just get it somehow. There's another company
Yeah.
that, it's not really developer first.
The thing about developer experiences, it all comes down to engagement and loyalty from the developers. And developers will give you engagement and loyalty if you give them an authentic experience. And so everybody goes, okay, well, what's an authentic developer experience? And the thing is there's no way to measure that. It's not scientific. It's part art. It's part science. But what I can tell you is that developers know right away when something isn't authentic. And I've tried to do my best guess at kind of describing what makes something authentic, and it's any sort of solution that blends itself into an existing developer workflow. So if you have a developer and there's something that they're doing on a regular basis, while they're writing code or another part of the tasks that they've got to do, if there's a way for you to just transparently blend that in to that, and then still deliver your solution through that without forcing them to learn something else, that tends to be a great authentic experience, and then that drives a lot of value. And we saw that with Heroku. Heroku was just a Git push, so you already were using Git, and so it just blended into that. We saw it with Snyk. Snyk, you still do a pull request. You don't have to change that, but Snyk started adding a lot of static analysis, AppSec testing capabilities. Um, you know, Even to a lesser degree, VS Code. VS Code made the plugin model just so transparent that that you don't even have to know that you're installing plugins. It just kind of starts adding these values as you start writing code, because it can infer what you want from that. So those are like great examples of how engineers were really thoughtful about not bending the existing experience too much and adding value at the same time.
Funny enough, I was just going to ask, how do you actually measure this developer experience? And you're right, it's hard to measure. Is there
Yeah.
any maybe high level things that you can be looking at just to get a sense or a pulse of developer experience?
Um, Anything you could, I mean, look, there's the obvious things of which projects are getting more contributors, which projects are getting more downloads and stuff like that. I think that's a proxy, maybe an early indicator that there's a great developer experience there. But frankly, the thing that I look for is a certain amount of joy. You can tell, like, if you're a developer and you hang out and just spend 20 minutes with a developer talking about a certain technology, there are those things that developers talk about scientifically, and then there's those things that they talk about emotionally. You're looking for the emotional ones.
The Vim versus Emacs.
Yeah, yeah, that's a whole different discussion point. They're both authentic experiences. That's just more, I think that's just more developer geekdom, because we there's certain trade-offs that developers are going to argue to the end of time, and Emacs and Vim are the personification of those trade-offs. And that, frankly, that those the trade-offs that they advocate, you could show up in distributed computing platforms, or blockchain architect. You pick a domain. It doesn't matter. Those same sort of problems materialize in other ways. I think Emacs and Vim are just an easy way for developers to get those arguments out on the table.
Definitely. I guess we're seeing it, everything from REST to GraphQL, NoSQL to SQL, always have to have a debate, right?
They always have to have a debate. Yeah, wouldn't be fun otherwise.
So where does this take us in a couple of years with all the no code, low code solutions out there? Does that mean developer experience is different? Is it changing? Will it look the same as today?
Well, I think I think we're going to see a replatforming of developer tools over the next decade or two for a couple of fundamental reasons. But that's not driven by low code. I think the low code, no code enthusiasm is really just solutions unlocking the ability for both developers and non-developers to build a class of applications that they couldn't build before. If you need to actually sling and write code and go through a whole life cycle tooling process, the application has to be something really special for you to invest all that time and energy to build it that way. So there was just, over the past 30 or 40 years, there's just a whole category of applications that people really wish they could build. They just couldn't afford to do it because it was too costly to do it with a code structure on that. And you just don't need the power and control that writing it with code is. So I think now, low code systems enable you to unlock those class of applications. And as a result, it allows more people to do application development because they don't have to have the same skill set. So I think that's there, and we're able to see those systems because there's now so many APIs, and those APIs are pluggable, and so they're reusable, and so these systems can really make it easy to wire those things together. Um, in terms of the developer experience, uh, over the past 50 or 60 years, the DevOps community has gone through massive waves of bundling and unbundling, and it takes about roughly 15 years per wave on that. And the previous 15 years was a massive unbundling effort, and the unbundling happened, on a paradigm shift, and the paradigm shift here was the introduction of Git in 2005. Git turned everything into distributed version control, and so really the whole tool chain has been reinvented, along those concepts, and we've gotten lots of individual silos. We're now starting to see evidence that there's going to be a great rebundling of all that. GitLab is a highly opinionated single platform that really tries to, offer a consistent workflow. GitHub is increasingly, expanding from the left and to the right to provide a one-stop shop of tool sets. And even vendors like JFrog and Docker, because they are kind of systems of record for all the dependencies that you need to work with, they can build really tight integrated broad-reaching workflows that bundle things together. So I think we're on this path of this massive bundling. And then we'll go through another unbundling exercise in maybe 5 to 10 years, probably driven by edge, where the edge, the idea of building applications on the edge is just all developers are going to have to understand a form of eventual consistency that's they just don't have to worry about in cloud computing architectures. And I think most of the tools and systems that we have today are really not well suited for that, and so there'll probably be a rethink again on that front.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see the next few years here. We're already seeing quite a few different folks, leverage stuff like MoStuff in the edge with Cloudflare Workers and a lot of other stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's still just the beginning days. Speaking of APIs a little more, and the unbundling of things, there's a lot of tooling right now in the API space, from focus on developers to security to analytics to the deployment of APIs. How do you see APIs and the way you work with them change over the next 5 years?
Well, the nice thing is I think, on a technical level, APIs are supporting more protocols. A lot of APIs are building in real-time streaming mechanisms, to get away from just the old request response mechanism. They're all going to be asynchronous. So you get, it allows APIs to perform better. There's going to be a lot more richer data that you can extract, when you're interacting with those APIs. And that'll enable, kind of a much richer types of consumer-based applications that can be built with them. That's one of technical trend, something that we're going to see. The second is, we're seeing a lot of businesses which are becoming API first businesses, which is they're disrupting brick and mortar systems, and they're doing it by just building a really rich API. While we're talking about this, I think something like GameStop is up 400%, or today, so all the Wall Street bets crowd have, they bought all these out of, it's really phenomenal, because this company is losing money hand over fist. It's a brick and mortar that is selling games that you don't need to go and physically buy anymore. You can go to websites and download these things. So by all means, there's this massive short experience. But all that's happened is that there's been new investors that have come in, and they said, well, we're going to turn GameStop into a global one-stop shopping video game digital delivery. So it's been digitally transformed now, and now it's a software company. It's not a brick and mortar sales stop. And lo and behold, look at the stock is going through the roof over the mania of that. But I mentioned all that because what they're talking about doing is designing a set of APIs for interacting with games, the distribution of games, and then they're going to retool the business in and around that. And so there you go on that front. So I think we'll see more APIs that are just disrupting these brick and mortar businesses. I worry about whether startups can do a great job if we haven't, a startup unfortunately is going to have to find such a niche area of API to deliver. And they're going to have to deliver such a phenomenal experience that enables an app developer to just be way better. Because we're now starting, like in communications, financials, content. We've got some mega vendors in the API space, and the mega vendors have worked really hard to simplify the API and do the integrations. And because they're buying in bulk, they give you relatively cheap rates. And so I think it's going to be hard for certain types of small startups to compete in similar areas. They're going to have to find new areas where API innovation hasn't happened yet.
Does this mean like things like vertical SaaS? I guess you're going to have these vertical APIs, or where do you see the next generation of API for startups going?
I think almost all of them are going to be some sort of vertical based, APIs, because it's the only that's where the disruptions need to take place, is in old legacy business processes that haven't been automated, that can be automated. And the API is just a simplification. Behind the scenes, it's doing the automation, but it's just the API interface is just a simplification of that process. It's there.
I'm just waiting to hear the jingle if there's an API for that.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, it's probably not far from that at this point. Yeah.
Speaking of like these API for startups, though, some huge news came out last week around the Plaid acquisition and the regulatory side. How is that going to impact fintech APIs and the overall API ecosystem?
Oh, we're back to the Wall Street bet scenario here. I think that the Plaid, I think that the public face of what we heard, that it was a regulatory issue, was a story of convenience on that. Because frankly, it had taken so long, 6 to 9 months, that the deal, the $5 billion with the growth that they've had, makes it just look too cheap at this point in time. So I think all things being equal, I think that the Plaid investors and the Plaid founders were looking for a way to get out of that deal. The company may very well be worth 10 or 15 billion at this point. So I think that their value hasn't been diminished at all. I think it just reinforces how important these things are, and it's just going to keep fueling the fire on others in this space.
That's a really good point, especially around just how that valuation changes so quickly for these API first companies.
Yeah, they grew 50 or 60%, and in this day and age with the multiple expansion, they probably doubled their value. So you might have had a lot of buyer's remorse sitting around the table, at the time, thinking $5 billion is we're gonna be worth $1 billion, but then you realize, but geez, we're actually worth 10. What do you do with that?
The Plaid CEO actually released a really interesting article around building an API first company, how sometimes it might take a little while to get things going because of the integration component, but once you are integrated, it's just exponential growth, right after. Does that mean founders should be looking at different things in terms of growth as an API first company versus a more traditional enterprise sales company?
I think the nice thing about building an API business is that you can measure engagement really clearly. If people are using your API and they use it more often, then you've done something right. But if they use it and abandon it, then something's not right. You've got more work to do, right? Either the interface isn't there, they didn't understand how to use it, or you're not providing enough value through the integrations that you're doing behind the scenes.
But what if there's no interface? What do you measure then? Just the API.
Yeah. Well, look, if you're obviously metering the API, your goal is to monetize that probably, and so the number of applications that are making use of that and ultimately paying you something is a great barometer for how effective the API is on that front.
Well, that's a really good point around metering the API. And then when it comes to billing, we've seen this huge trend over the last couple of years towards this pay-as-you-go model. A lot of it was driven from AWS Lambda. We've seen Algolia move towards this. Where do you think billing is going in the future when it comes to these API first companies?
I think there's a lot of talk about the pay-as-you-go model, but I think that at scale, when you look at the businesses who are really generating a lot of money over APIs, they're none of their large customers are actually paying as they go. They work in contracts that force them to buy a minimum amount of consumption, but also prevents burst billing or unplanned consumption and whatnot. So it kind of bounds it. And that's in the API company's interest, because they want to have predictability on the revenue that they're going to get, and the buyer doesn't want to end up overpaying because they had some rogue developer go to town on something that way. So I think the pay as you go is great as a great way to get developers started. It's a great way for people to find affinity for the service that you've got. But once you start to have a real community and it's really starting to grow, you have a tendency to turn over a lot of those things into contractualized relationships. and that's the natural evolution of things.
No, that's a really good point, especially when we think about these developer first companies. You, in some ways, you're selling to the developers first, try to get them integrated, but you still have an enterprise sales process you still have to run, right? It's
That's
almost
right.
two companies at the same time.
At the same time, yeah, yeah, and it's you can get a lot of traction in the meantime, and and then when it's time for you to scale your business, then you think about doing those sorts of things that are appropriate for scaling your business on that.
Definitely. Well, cool. Really appreciate having you here, Tyler, today. Anything else you would like to add for our listeners?
No, thank you for having me. This was great.
Cool. Well, thank you very much.